said. So with that, I'd like to begin. I'm going to spend about 2 to 5 minutes on language, because I don't think music is a language. I think it's a literature. Music doesn't have a grammar. So I don't think it's a language. But the interesting thing is, from all of the research that I've done and my colleagues, we find that we learn music and we learn language in a very similar way. So if I start in talking about music, the way we learn music, you're going to find it difficult to learn unless you have the parallel of language, which you're all familiar with. So I'd like to remind you of the way you, and I suspect most persons, learn language. The first thing we understand is that we all have 5 vocabularies. We have a listening vocabulary. And then we have a speaking vocabulary. And then we have a thinking vocabulary. Then reading, and then writing. And the interesting thing is with these vocabularies, they develop sequentially. If the listening vocabulary isn't well established, the other 4 vocabularies suffer. They can't develop very, very well. So I'm going to spend a great deal of time on the listening vocabulary in music, because the same thing is true about music. If we don't develop listening very well, all of our other study in music is going to be extremely difficult. Now, what we have learned about language development in listening is that the more difference children hear when they're very, very young, I'm talking about birth soon after, the more different words they hear, the better they're going to learn language. Many persons have felt that the more different words they hear, they're going to become confused. And all of the research just disagrees with that completely. And I won't go into all the detail unless you ask me about the research we've done in music to show that that's also the case in music. But if I can just say to you, for example, one of the big problems with our society today with language, and so many persons talk about the dumbing down of our society, is because most persons have been getting more and more limited vocabulary. Why is that? Because they haven't had opportunity to hear a rich vocabulary. Most of the words they hear are like, you know, I mean, awesome, incredible, basically. And like, you know, I mean. And they find it very difficult to express themselves, mainly because of TV, the media, lack of parental guidance. They don't have the rich vocabulary, and that's what the problem is today with language. They don't have a context. So that listening vocabulary is extremely important. Then, of course, comes speaking. Why is listening so important? Because most children learn to speak what they have heard. If they haven't heard anything, they don't speak much. If they've heard a lot, they have a lot to choose from, and that broadens their ability to speak. And so once they start speaking, at about 2 years old, they begin to think, ask questions, answer questions. And that works very, very well. But if they haven't listened, and if they don't have a speaking vocabulary, chances are they're not going to think very broadly. And then, of course, somewhere around 5 years old, when they go to school, they begin to formally learn how to read and write. So it's about a 5-year process. The critical period for their learning is from birth to 18 months old. I call it critical because unless they learn what they should learn in listening from birth to 18 months old, it can't be remedied. All it can do is be compensated for. We have compensatory learning for those who didn't learn from birth to 18 months old. So it's a very critical period, probably the most important time. Most persons say children from birth to 18 months old learn more in that 18-month period than they'll learn in any other 18-month period throughout their life. And there's a sensitive period that goes up to 5 years old. So we have those 5 vocabularies. Now, if you can think about that, please, I'd appreciate it, and I'd like to get the music as soon as I can. Any questions at this point before listening and music. Listening is basic. What should children listen to at a very early age? I'm not speaking about prenatally now. I know very little about that except what I read. I don't do that research. But I do research from birth on. And I would say to you, one of the best things we can do is to develop a listening vocabulary, is to let babies hear as many different tonalities as possible. By tonalities, you probably call them modes, I call them tonalities. If you want to ask me why I don't call them modes, I'll get into that. But for now, let me just say I consider major a tonality, minor a tonality, Dorian, Phrygian. So the listening vocabulary, bum, bing, bum, bum, bia, da, ba, da, bum, da, ba, da, ba, bia, bum, bia, da, ba, bum, bum, bum. If you can do something like that in major for children, just let them hear something very repetitious, sequential, short, and above all, no words. The research we find is that if we sing with words, children, because of their environment, are so inundated with language, the brain being a very lazy organ, they will start concentrating on the words and not listen to the music. So they don't derive from the music what they need to know. So all of the singing that is done should be done best with what I call labial syllables, those in the front of the mouth. La, ba, 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 ya, da, ba, what a young child does or a baby does upon birth, a babbling. Bum, ba, da, ya, da, ba, bum, ya, da, ba, bum, 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 as expressively as possible. And then maybe just as quickly as you can, minor. Yam, bum, ya, dum, ya, da, dee, bum, ba, da, bum, ya, dum, ya, dum, bum, 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 bum. And you leave plenty of silence for them to make comparisons and relationships. And that's what creates a great listening vocabulary, the opportunity to make comparisons and listening. We find if all we do is teach in major, students don't develop a listening vocabulary worth anything. As a matter of fact, they don't develop very much at all musically. And that's unfortunately the problem with most music education. They hear so much major, almost to the total abandonment of minor. So both major and minor, and I'm talking about harmonic minor, so that they hear ya da dee ya da da la da dee ya dum bum bum. Now, if we can get that done, that would be wonderful. But we can get so much more from the listening vocabulary.